Hey, what's up guys, it's Recorder here, and today we're going to make something very exciting. As you can see, we are going to create the slide and login and registration form using only HTML and CSS. We're also going to use a little bit of JavaScript to create the simple carousel that we have beside the forms. Now this is going to be completely responsive on any device, so if I make this a little bit smaller here, you will see that our login and registration form still looks good on very small screens. Okay, that's pretty much what we are building today, so get yourself ready and let's start coding. Now this video is sponsored by Wondershare Mockitt. Mockitt is an online UI and UX design platform that can be used to create prototypes, vector designs, flowcharts, and other interactive diagrams. I have been using it for a while and I loved how much easy and fast it was to build a prototype. So with Mockitt's prototyping tool, you can easily design interactive prototypes that highlight your concepts and appeal to your clients. And with Mockitt's powerful design tool, you will be able to create pixel-perfect icons and scalable vector graphics. Now Mockitt works on every major platform as well as your web browser, so make sure to check Wondershare Mockitt website for more information, or you can just click on the link down below in the description. Okay, and now before we get started, I just want to ask you to go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed yet, and also hit that like button if you want to see more tutorials just like this one. Okay, so I'm opening right now my text editor, which is VS Code. I'm also opening Google Chrome in the other window. So as you can see, we have here the final version of the form that I showed you at the beginning of this video. Now going back to VS Code, I already created the project folder. Inside of that, we just have a folder with a bunch of images that we're gonna use in our login and registration form. Great. Now we can start by creating our files. So we're gonna first create an index.html file. We're also gonna create a style.css file. And finally, we're gonna create a app.js file. Next, you want to go inside our index.html file. Here we're gonna use exclamation mark and hit enter to get our boilerplate HTML code. Now we can just put here sign in and sign up form as a title of the page. Then after that, we need to import our CSS and JavaScript files. So let's first put in here a link tag within href of style.css. Then let's go to the end of the body element. Here we can add the comment of JavaScript file. Then underneath that, we're gonna add the script tag with the source equal to app.js. Nice. So here we added the script tag at the end of the body element to make sure that our JavaScript code loads after our entire page is parsed. Great. After we import our CSS and JavaScript files, we can now start creating the form. So let's first add the main tag, and that's gonna be the background. Then in here, we're gonna add a div with class of box, which is going to represent the white box. I also want to wrap this into a div with the class of inner box. So the reason why I added this additional container is because we want to have some padding in the sides of the white box. And since we're going to position absolute everything, that means we cannot use the padding property. So instead, we're gonna have that additional container which will have a width and height of 100% of the box div minus some fixed amount of pixels. This way we're gonna have some kind of padding in the sides. Great. Now inside the inner box div, we're gonna have a part for the forms and a part for the carousel. So back here, we're gonna add a div with the class of forms wrap, and right underneath that, we're gonna add a div with the class of carousel. Now before we move on and add the forms, the images of the carousel and the other stuff, I'm gonna stop here to style and align this so that we can add the rest of the page and style it very comfortably. So let's first open this up with live server. As you can see, we have a completely white page, and that's because for now we just have a couple of empty divs. Great. Let's now head over to our style sheet. So first thing I want to do here is add in a reset. For that, I'm gonna add the universal selector to select all the elements we have inside our page. Then in here, we want first to get rid of all the paddings by setting padding to 0 for all the elements, and let's also get rid of the margins. So the reason why I'm doing this is because some elements such as the headings and the paragraph tags already have some margin and padding by default. So to make sure we don't have any issue in the future, we just got rid of all the margins and the paddings. One more thing I want to do here is set box size into border box. This way, when we will add some padding or margin to an element, its width will not be affected by that padding and margin. Great, so that's it for the reset. Now we can select the main element, and here we want first to make sure that it's taking 100% of the width. After that, I want it to have a minimum height of 100 VH, which means the main element will take 100% of the viewport height, but if the content spans more than that, the height of the main element will expand to contain the new content. After that, we want to set overflow to hidden. Then we want to change background color to FF8C6P, which is that orange color. And finally, let's give it a padding of 2 rem. This way on smaller screens, we're gonna have some space between the white box and the edges of the viewport. Save that. And as you can see, the background color has now changed to that orange color. Let's keep going. So now we're gonna select the box div, which is this. Then in here, we're gonna first set max width to 1020 pixels. This way, the box div will have a width of 1020 pixels, but when the screen goes smaller than that, the box div will shrink to fit in the screen. After that, let's give it a height of 640 pixels. And finally, let's give it a background color of white. Save that, and there is our box div. Now we need to move it to the center. So for that, I'm gonna go to its parent, which is the main element. Then in here, I'm gonna add a display of flex. This way, the main element will turn into a flex container, and its direct child, which is the box div, will turn into a flex item. After we set display to flex, we can now align the flex item, which is the box div, however we want inside the flex container. So in order to align it in the vertical axis, or I should say in the cross axis, we use the align items property. And if I set that to center, that means our flex item will be aligned vertically in the center. Then if you want to align it in the horizontal axis, we use the justify content property. So let's set that to center. This way our box div will be aligned both horizontally and vertically in the center. Save that, and we cannot see anymore our box div. I think that's because CSS flexbox removes the 100% width that some elements have by default. So let's make sure here that the box div will always have a width of 100%, then hit save, and there we go. After that, you want to have a border radius of 3.3 rem, like so. And finally, let's add a box shadow. So we're gonna have 0 in the horizontal offset, 60 pixels in the vertical offset, which means the shadow will be at the bottom. After that, we're gonna have 40 pixels in the shadow blur, minus 30 pixels in the shadow size. And finally, for the shadow color, we're gonna set that to RGBA 000, and finally 0.27 for the color opacity. Save that, and now we have a nice transparent shadow. Great. Let's style now the inner box div, which is going to have a smaller width and smaller height than the box div. This way there will be some kind of padding in the edges of the white box. So back here I'm gonna select the inner box div, but before actually doing anything here, let's first give the box div a position of relative, because we're gonna give it a position of absolute. So to make sure it's going to be positioned relatively to the box div, I give that box div a position of relative. So after we add the position of absolute, let's give it for now a width of 100%, a height of 100% as well. Then let's add the background color of red so that we can see what's going on. So as you can see right now, the inner box is taking the full width and the full height. Now I want to decrease 4.1 rem from both width and height. So for that, I'm gonna put this inside the calc function, like so. Then I'm gonna say minus 4.1 rem. Let's do the same thing with the height. Great, so as you can see now, the inner box is now taking the full width and the full height, but minus 4.1 rem. Now last thing we need to do is move this to the center. So all you have to do here is set top to 50% and left to 50% as well. Now this just centers the top left corner of the inner box. So to truly center it, we need to translate it backwards by half of its width and height. Hit save, and as you can see, the inner box div is now perfectly centered, and we also have now that pattern in the edges. Great, let's remove this background color because we don't need that anymore. So now it's time to style and align the forms wrap div and the carousel div. So if we go back here, you will notice that the forms div will be on left, taking up around 45% of the full width, and the carousel div will be on right, taking up the remaining 55%. So that's exactly what we're going to do now. We're gonna first grab here the forms wrap div, then inside of that we wanna first set position to absolute so that we can size and position our elements however we want inside its parent, which is the inner box div. Then I'm going to set height to 100% so that it has the full height. After that I'm gonna set width to 45%, and finally let's make sure it's going to be on left by setting top to 0 and left to 0. Let's also give this a background color of green so that we can see clearly what's going on. There you go. Let's move now to the carousel div. So same thing again, we're gonna have a position of absolute, a height of 100%, but this time instead of having a width of 45%, we're gonna have 55%. After that we need to make sure that it's going to be on right. For that I'm gonna set left to 45% since the forms div ends at 45%. Then again we're gonna have top 0, and finally let's give this a background color of red. And there you go. So as you can see, we have now the carousel div on right, and it's taking the remaining 55% of width, just like we have here. Now actually the forms div will not have any background color, so let's remove that here. But on the other hand, the carousel div is going to have a light orange background color. So let's remove this red color and let's add instead FFE0D2, just like so. Now let's make the corners rounded like we have here. So we just have to set border radius to 2 rem and that's it. Great, so I think now we can move on and add the rest of the page content. So let's go back to our HTML file, then let's open the forms wrap div. Now we're just gonna add the login form for now, and later when we're gonna finish signing that, we can add then the registration form as well. So we're gonna have here a form tag and we're gonna give it a class of sign-in form so that we can separate this from the sign up form. Then for the action attribute, I'm gonna set that to index.html since this is not going anywhere, and finally let's also set autocomplete to off. Now it's not necessary to turn off the autocomplete, I'm just doing this to disable those annoying autocomplete suggestions so that we can work on our inputs comfortably. Let's open that. So in here we're gonna have first a div with class of logo, and basically this is going to hold the logo image like so. Let's make sure we add inside the art attribute easy class, and it's also going to hold the title. So let's add underneath that an h3 hidden of easy class. Great, so after that logo div, we're gonna have another div, but this time with class of hidden. So basically in here we're gonna have an h2 of welcome back, then below that we're gonna have an h6 that says not registered yet, and finally we're gonna have the link which is going to switch the page form to the sign up form when we click on it. So let's give it a class of toggle, then let's say here sign up. So yeah, as you can see, the part at top is the logo div, and this area right here is the heading div where we have the toggle link. So now last thing we need to add is this part right here where we're gonna have the inputs and the submit button. So back here I'm gonna go underneath the heading div, then I'm gonna add a new div which I'm gonna name actual form. Now inside of that I wanna wrap each input and its label inside the div that I will name input wrap. So in here we're gonna add an input tag with the class of input field. Now for the input type I'm gonna leave it text since this is going to be a username field. Then let's make sure that the minimum length is set to 4, autocomplete to off, and finally let's add required. This way the user cannot submit the form if this input field is empty. Just underneath that we're gonna add a label. So to associate this label to the input element above, I'm gonna set the for attribute to name. Then I will go back to the input and give it an ID of name again. So this is useful because when we're gonna click on the label, the input will get focused. Great. Now let's add the password field. So I'm just gonna duplicate this whole thing, then I'm gonna do some changes here. So first we're gonna change type to password, then we're gonna change its ID to pass, and finally let's make sure we also change this to pass. This way the label will be associated with the password input. Finally we're gonna have here password, and that's it. After that we're gonna have the submit button. So let's add an input tag with the class of sign button, then let's make sure we change the type to submit, and finally let's set value to sign in. So that's the text we're gonna have on the button. Great, now we still need to add this little forgot password text. So below that I'm gonna add a paragraph tag with the class of text, then in here I'm gonna paste this text right here, then I'm gonna add a link that says get help, and right after that we're gonna continue our text. So let's say get help signing in. Okay, so that's what we have for now. As you can see, if I click on the label, the input beside will get focused, and also we cannot submit this form if we leave these inputs empty or if we type something less than 4 characters. Great, so that's exactly what we want. Now let's go ahead and style this. So back here inside our style sheet, I'm gonna grab the whole form. So what I wanna do first is make everything smaller like we have here in the final version. So basically we want the form to go from here to here. To do that, we just have to give the form a maximum width of 260 pixels, and that should fix it. Now let's also make sure that width is set to 100%. This way if the screen goes smaller and the form cannot fit anymore inside its parent, it will then shrink and take its parent width. Finally, let's give our form a background color of red so that we can see it clearly. Hit save, and the form has now a width of 260 pixels. Great, after that we need to push it to the center. So for that we just have to set margin to 0 on top and bottom, and auto on left and right. Let's also set height to 100% so that it has the full height. Then hit save again, and there we go. Our form is now at the middle and it's also taking the full height. Great, so let's remove this. Now let's move the logo. So as you can see, it's right now a little bit big, so let's go ahead and fix that. So underneath this, I'm gonna select the logo div, which is the wrapper of both the image and the title. Then in here, I'm gonna set this splice flex. This way, both the image and the title will come next to each other because CSS flexbox puts the flex items in one row by default. Then let's add align item center to make sure that our flex items will be vertically centered. But the image is still big, so let's select it underneath that. Then let's give it a width of 27 pixels. I think I'm also gonna give it a margin of 0.3 rem. And now we're good. Next, we need to change the page font. And the font that we're going to use is again the Poppins font. So let's go to Google Fonts, then let's search here for Poppins. Click on that. So now we're gonna select the size that we're gonna use. So we're gonna go with extra light, light 300, regular 400, medium 500. Let's also do semi-bold 600, bold 700, and finally let's do extra bold 800. Once we do that, we can grab this import code and then go to the first line of our CSS file and paste it right in there. After we import the font, we can now go to the body element and set font family to Poppins and serif. Hit save and there we go. But the inputs are still having that default font, and that's because the input element, unlike the other elements, doesn't inherit the font from the body. So to make sure they also use the font, we need to select them here as well. Hit save now and that's it. The inputs are now using the Poppins font. Great, let's go back here. So now we want to style the logo title. So I'm gonna select the H4 element inside the logo div. Then in here I'm just gonna change font size to 1.1 rem. I'm also gonna give it a margin top of -9 pixels so that it moves 9 pixels towards top. Let's also set letter spacing to -0.5 pixels. And finally I'm gonna change its color to 151111. Great, now if we go back here, you will notice that we're gonna have kind of margin around the three main parts of our form. So to achieve that, we're gonna go to the wrapper of the three main parts, which is the form element. Then we're gonna set this splice flex, which means that the direct children of the form, which are the logo, the heading, and the actual form divs, will be now flex items. So as soon as I save that, you will notice that our flex items are now in one row because, as I said before, these are the default settings of CSS flexbox. So if you want them to go vertically instead as a column, we just have to set flex direction to column and that should fix it. Great. Now we can set justify content to space around, and that's gonna take the remaining space we had below the flex items and put it around them just like so. But the problem here is that the space before the first flex item and after the last flex item is smaller than the space between the flex items. So to make sure that all the space will be equal, we just have to change this to space evenly and that should fix it. Great, so that's exactly what we need. Let's keep going. So now we want to style this part right here. Let's start with the welcome back heading. So down here we're going to select the H2 inside the heading div. Then inside of that we want to first increase font size to 2.1 rem. We also want to change font weight to 600. And finally let's change color to 151111. So as you can see, the welcome back heading is now bigger and it's also a little bit thinner. Great, let's move now to this not register the text. So we're gonna select this time the H6 hidden. Then in here we need first to change color to BA, which is a gray color. Then we need to decrease font weight to 400, and let's also decrease font size to 0.75 rem. Hit save, and there we go. Now last thing we have is this sign in link. But first, let's make it in the same line as the not registration yet text. So we just have to give the H6 a display of inline, and that's it. Now we can start styling the link. So underneath that, we're going to select the toggle class, which is the class we gave to our link. Then in here, I want to first change the color to 151111. I also want to get rid of that underline we have on the link. So let's set text decoration to none. And finally, let's decrease font size to 0.75 rem. And let's also make the link a little bit bolder by giving it a font weight of 500. Great, now let's change the color when we hover on this. So back here, I'm gonna first add a transition of 0.3 seconds to make sure that the link color will change smoothly. Then below that, we're gonna select again our link, but this time with the hover selector. So when we hover on the link, we wanna change its color to this color right here, which is a purple color. Hit save, then let's move our cursor over the link, and there we go. Great, now let's style these inputs. So back here, I'm gonna grab each input wrap div, like so. Then in here, I want to first give them a position of relative so that we can mess around with the inputs and the label inside of them. After that, I'm gonna give them a fixed height of 37 pixels and a margin bottom of 2 rem. Great, so that's what we have. let's grab now the inputs. So we're gonna say here .input field, which is the class we gave to our inputs. Then we're gonna add a position of absolute, which means we can move and size our inputs however we want inside its parent, which is the input wrap div. Let's do the same thing with the label, like so. So now if I save that, you can see that both the input and the label are now stacked up because they have both been removed from the document flow. Let me just give this a background color of red so that we can see clearly what's going on. Now let's go back to the input field. So below that I'm gonna give it a width of 100% and a height of 100%, which means we're now making our input the size of its parent. After that we wanna get rid of the white background that the inputs have by default. We also want to get rid of the border and the outline as well. Great, let's remove this now. So the inputs are now kind of invisible. So let's give them here a border bottom of 1 pixel, solid and with a color of BBB. Great, let's remove the text we typed on the inputs. So as you can see, the labels are not perfectly centered in the vertical axis. So to fix that, we need first to add here left 0 to make sure that our labels will be attached to the left edge of our inputs. Then we can say top 50% to move them 50% from the top edge, and then translate them backwards by half of their height, which means now they're gonna be perfectly centered in the vertical axis. Great, now before we keep styling these labels, let's first style the actual text inside the input, then we can go back to our labels. So underneath that, we need first to remove the padding so that we make sure that the text will be also attached to the left edge of the input. Then we need to decrease font size to 0.95 rem. And finally, let's change color to 151111. But before we save that, let's hide the labels just so we can see clearly what we are typing. Nice, so let's type something here and there we go. Great, now we can go back to our labels. So after that, you want to give them the same font size as the input text, which is 0.95 rem. Then let's change their color to BBB, which is the same color we gave to the border. Great, so that's what we have. Now I'm also going to add here pointer events none. This way we'll make the labels unclickable. So basically they are now kind of placeholder. After we do that, there is no more need to associate each label here to the input above it. So let's just get rid of this for attribute and this ID. Great, so now in our input get focus, we want to move the label to the top edge of the input just like we have here. To do that, we have to write a little bit of JavaScript code. It's very simple, so we need first to grab all of our inputs. For that, we're gonna say document.querySelectorAll, then in here we're gonna add .input field. So now this querySelectorAll method will grab all the inputs and put them into what's called a node list, which is similar to an array. So basically, if we want to do something with these inputs, we need to loop through that node list, and the best way to do that is by using the forEach method. So for each input we have, I'm gonna take that input and give it an event listener of focus. So whenever our input gets focus, we want to run an arrow function, and all this is going to do is take the input that got focus and add a class named active to it. Hit save, then let's open the inspector. Let's go inside of that. So as you can see right now, our input has only the input field class, but when it's gonna get focus, the active class will be added. And the same thing with the password field. Great. Now we need to remove that active class when our input loads focus. So after we give the input an event listener of focus, we're gonna give it this time an event listener of blur, which is the opposite of focus. So whenever our input loses focus, we're gonna run again an arrow function, but this one is going to take the input that loses focus and then remove the active class from it. Let's give this a try. So if I click on the input, the active class will be added, and if I click somewhere else outside the input, that active class will be removed. Now the problem is that when we type something here, then we click somewhere else outside the input, we don't want to remove that active class, because if we have the active class, that means the label will be on top, and if we don't have the active class, that means the label will go back to its original position. So in this case, when the active class is removed, the label will be in front of the text that we typed, which is not exactly what we want. So to fix that, we need first to check here if the input is empty or not before we remove the active class. So for that, we're gonna say if our input.value is not equal to empty pair of quotes. In other words, if our input is not empty, then we just want to return, which essentially will stop our function from executing any further, and we want to remove that active class. So right now, if I leave the input empty and I click somewhere else outside, the active class will be removed. But if I type something here, that means our input is not empty. And so even if our input loses focus, dash active class will not be removed. Great, so based on if the input has dash active class or not, we want to change some of these settings. So if the input has dash active class, we want first to change the border color to 151111, which is dash black color. But before we actually save that, let's give our input a transition of 0.4 seconds to make sure again that the animation will be smooth. Great, so let's click here and there we go, the border color has changed. Next thing we want to do when the input has dash active class is moving the label to the top edge like we have here and making it smaller. So again, below that, when the input has the active class, we want to first access to the label we have after that input. For that, we're going to add here plus label. Then in here, we're just going to decrease font size to 0.75 rem. And then we're going to change top to -2 pixels. This way the label will be at the top edge. Great. Let's also give the label a transition of 0.4 seconds. Then hit save. So let's click now on the input and there we go. So as you can see, if we type something here and then our input loses focus, the label stays at top, which is exactly what we want. Great, let's keep going. So now it's time to style the submit button. So below that, we're going to select the sign button class. Then in here, we want first to set display to inline block so that we can set width and height, because actually with display inline, which is the default value, we cannot do that. Okay, so let's set width to 100% and height to 43 pixels. After that, we want it to have a background color of again 151111, and then we want to change the text color to white. Great. Now we want to get rid of the border that the submit button has by default, and we also want to give it a cursor pointer, like so. Next, we want to have some border radius, so below that I'm going to set border radius to 0.8 rem. There we go. And lastly, we want to change font size to 0.8 rem, and we also want to add a margin bottom of 2 rem. Great, so that's what we have. Let's now give this some hover effects. So let's first add here a transition of 0.3 seconds. Then let's come underneath that and say .sign button hover. So when we hover on the sign button, we want to change its background color to that same purple color that we gave to the toggle link. Save that and that's it. Nice. Now last thing we have is this forgot password text. So let's go ahead and style that. First, we're gonna select the text class, which is the class we gave to our forgot password text. Then in here we will change color to BBB, which is that gray color, and after that we will decrease font size to 0.7 rem. Like so. Now the link color has not changed, so let's go back here and select our link, like so. Then let's set again color to BBB and that should fix it. Now our link is gonna have a hover effect, so let's first give it a transition of 0.3 seconds. Then let's come underneath that and set .text hover. So when we hover on the link, we want to change its color to that same color we used with the submit button and the toggle link. Great, so yeah, I think that's it for the login form. Now it's time to add the registration form. So going back to our HTML code, I will come below the sign in form, then I'm just gonna duplicate it. Now let's make sure that the new form is going to have a class of sign up form, and there we go. Right now we cannot see the whole new form, so let's go ahead and hide the login form so that you can see clearly the sign up form. So let's select the sign in form, like so, then let's set display to none. Great, now the new form is still a login form, so let's go back here and change it to a registration form. First we're gonna have here get started, then below that we're gonna have already have an account, and finally for the toggle link we will have sign in instead. Great, so in addition to the username and the password fields, we're gonna have another input field, and that is going to be the email field. So let's make sure we change the type to email, and that's it. After that, let's change the submit button value to sign up, and finally for the little text we have below the submit button, we're going to remove all of this and write a new one. So let's say by signing up, I agree to the terms of services. Now for this one, we're gonna put it inside a link, and open again an anchor tag, privacy policy. Hit save, and there we go. So as you can see, we get some kind of email validation on the email input, and that's because we gave it a type of email. Nice, so that's what we have. Now we can start working on the sliding animation. So let's first bring back the sign in form, like so. Now we don't want to have the registration form underneath the login form. Instead, we want them to be stacked up. So to do that, we need to go to the forms wrap div, which is the direct parent of our two forms. Then we're gonna give it a display of grid, which means now this forms wrap div will turn into a grid container and our two forms will turn into grid items. Now CSS Grid allows us to create different columns and rows to align the grid items within those columns and rows. So to create columns, we use the grid template columns property. In our case, we want only one column that takes the full width. So for that, I'm gonna add here only 1FR, which means it's gonna create one column with a width of 1FR. Now if we add another 1FR beside that, this means we're gonna have two columns of 1FR. Great. Now 1FR or one fraction means one part of the available space. And since we only have here one column, that means it's gonna take the whole space. After that, we can use the grid template rows property to create rows. Again, here we only want to have one row that takes the full height. So I'm just gonna add here again 1FR. Hit save. Then let's open the inspector. After that, let's enable the grid view. So as you can see right now, we have one column, but we have two rows. And that's because there was no more space for the registration form, and so it went down into a new row. Now in CSS Grid, we have something called lines, which are basically those dividers that you see around our column and our two rows. And the cool thing here is that we can place our grid items onto the grid using those lines. So let's say we position both of the forms from row line 1 to row line 2 and from column line 1 to column line 2. That means they're going to be both at the first column and the first row, which means they're going to be stacked up, which is exactly what we want. So let's do that. So inside the form styles, we can use the grid column property to align our forms using the column lines. So let's say here we want them to start in the first column line and end on the second column line. Just below that, we can use the grid row property, which does the same thing as the grid column property, except it's for the row lines. So let's say we want the forms to go from row line 1 to row line 2. Hit save, and there we go, the forms are now stacked up. So as you can see, they are both starting at row line 1 and ending at row line 2, and starting again at column line 1 all the way to column line 2. Great, now we need to hide the form and keep the other one visible. In our case, we're gonna hide the sign up form and keep the sign in form visible. So let's select below that the sign up form, then let's change its opacity to 0. I'm also gonna set pointer events to none. This way the sign up form won't capture our click events or our cursor options. Great. I think here we should have an H3 instead of H4. Let's see. Exactly, so let's change this to H4. Also here should have a margin right instead, because we want the margin to be just on the right of the logo image. Great. Now the way that we're gonna switch between the sign in and the sign up form is by toggling a class that we will name sign up mode. So if we click on the sign up button, that class will be added, which means we're gonna move to the sign up form. And if we click on the sign in button, that class will be removed, which means we're gonna move back to the sign in form. Great, so to do that, we need to jump back into our JavaScript file. Here we need first to grab both the sign in and the sign up buttons that we were clicking. Now since I gave them both the same toggle class, we're just gonna add here one variable named toggle button. Then we're just gonna say document.querySelectorAll.toggle. So now both the buttons are inside this variable. After that, we need to grab the element that we're gonna give it that sign up mode class. In our case, that is going to be the main element. So let's say document.querySelector main. Great. Now for each toggle button, I'm gonna take that button and give it an event listener of click. So whenever we click on one of those buttons, we're gonna run a function, and all this is going to do is get the main element, get the class list, and then toggle that sign up mode class. Which means if we click on one of those toggle buttons for the first time, it's gonna add that sign up mode class to the main element. Then if we click again on one of the toggle buttons, doesn't matter if it's the same one we clicked before, it's gonna remove that sign up mode class, and so on. Hit save. So here is the main element. Now if I click on the toggle button, the sign up mode will be added to that main element, and if I click again, it's gonna be removed. Let's click another time and it will be added again, and so on. Great, so that's it for the JavaScript code. Let's go back now to our style sheet. So now every time the main element has that sign up mode class, we're gonna take the forms wrap div and then move it 55% from left. After that, let's go back to our forms wrap div. Then let's give it a transition of 0.8 seconds. Let's also change speed type to ease in out, which basically means that the animation will start slowly and then end slowly again. Hit save, then let's click on the toggle button, and there we go. After that, we need to move the carousel div to the left. So going back here, I'm gonna first give it that same transition we gave to the forms. Then below that, we're just gonna duplicate this. So again, when the main element has that sign up mode class, we're gonna target this time the carousel div. Then we're just gonna bring it back to left 0. Save that. So now when I will click on the toggle button, the carousel will move to the left, and we're also gonna get this nice sliding animation. Great. Now last thing we need to do is every time the sign up mode class is added, that means when we click on this sign up button, we want to hide this login form and show the sign up form that we hid before. So let's first hide the sign in form. For that, we're gonna take again the main element with the sign up mode class, then we wanna target the sign in form. So to hide it, we're just gonna set opacity to 0 and pointer events to none. After that, you want to show the sign up form. So let's just copy this and paste it underneath. Then let's target this sign, the sign up form. Now in order to show it again, we just have to increase opacity to 1 and then enable the click events by changing this to all. That's it. Let's see. So click on that and there we go. Finally, we don't want the form to change as soon as we click on the toggle button. Instead, we want it to change when it's behind the carousel div. To do that, we need to add some delay before we change the opacity of our forms. So let's go back to the form settings. Here we're gonna add the transition, and the property that we wanna apply this transition on is the opacity property. So let's specify it here. Now if you wanna add a delay, we must specify a duration, otherwise this is not gonna work. So let's add here a very small duration like 0.02 seconds, which is 20 milliseconds. And finally, for the delay, we want the forms to change at the middle of the slider animation. And since the slider animation duration is 0.8 seconds, we're gonna wait 0.4 seconds, which is half of 0.8, to make sure that the form will change when it's behind the carousel div. Save that. Then let's click on the toggle button and there we go. As you can see, the form changes when it's behind the carousel div. So yeah, I think that's it for the slider animation. Let's move now to the last part of this project, which is this carousel. So let's go back to our HTML code, then let's open the carousel div. Now inside the carousel div, we're gonna have a div that's gonna hold the images and another div that's gonna hold the text slider and the bullets. So let's go back here and add a div with class of images wrapper. So this is the div that's going to hold the images. And right underneath that, we're gonna add the other div that's gonna hold the text slider and the bullets. So let's name it text slider. Great. Now going back here, we're gonna drop our images. So let's go inside the image folder, then let's take this image right here. Now I'm gonna give it a class of image, which is the class we're gonna use to style all of our images. And I'm also gonna give it a second class of image-1, which we're gonna use to separate this image from the others. After that, let's add the other images. So let's change this to image2.png. And let's also change this class to image-2. And finally, for the third image, we're gonna have here 3, and we're gonna have a class of image-3 instead. Great. Let's move now to the text slider div. Again, here we're gonna have a div for the text slider and a div for the bullets. So let's first add inside of that a div for the text wrapper, then let's add a div for the bullets. Now inside the text wrap div, we're gonna add another div called text group. So this is where the actual text goes. Now each line of the text is going to be an H2 hidden. So let's add the first H2 hidden, and this is going to be create your own courses. Let's duplicate this. Then inside the second H2, we're gonna have customize as you like. And finally inside the third one, we're gonna have invite students to your class. Nice. Last thing we have here is the bullets div. So let's open that and create 3 span elements where each span here represents a bullet. Now I'm gonna leave this active class only on the first span, because if we take a look at the bullets, you will see that the first one is going to be a little bit wider, and it's also gonna have that black background color. So we're gonna have all of this inside that active class, and what we wanna do in JavaScript is when we click on another one of these, we wanna switch it over, basically take that class off of here and put it onto here. But here the first bullet is going to be the default, so we can have that class of active on it. Alright, so that's the carousel section. Let's take a look. So as you can see, the images are too big. So let's go ahead and fix that first. But before we do anything, let me just move the carousel settings all the way down here. Great. Now we can select our images. So let's target the image class, which is again the class we gave to the images. And then in here, we're just gonna set width to 100%. This way, all the images are going to take the width of their parent. Great. After that, we need to suck up the images. So for that, we're just gonna use the same trick we used with the forms. So again, we're gonna give the images wrapper a display of grid. Then we're gonna set grid template columns to 1 of R to create one column that takes the full width. Let's also make sure that we're gonna have only one row that takes also the full height. Now let's move to the images. Here we want each image to go from column line 1 to line 2, and from row line 1 to row line 2. This way they will be all in the same column and in the same row, which means they're all going to be stacked up. Great. Now actually we don't want to show all the images at the same time. Instead, we only want to show one image, which is going to be by default the first image. So below that, we're gonna set opacity to 0 to hide all the images. Then we need to show the first image. So let's first give it here a class of show. Then let's come underneath that and target the image with the class of show. So to show the image, we just have to increase opacity to 1, and that's it. Great. Now before we keep going, let me select the bullets div and give it temporarily a height of 10 pixels and the background color of red, just so that we can visualize it. Nice, so there is the bullets div. Let's move on. So now we can grab the text slider div, which is the wrapper of the actual text slider and the bullets. Here we need to center both the text and the bullets div horizontally and vertically. For that, we're gonna add the display of flex. Then we're gonna set align items to center and justify content to center as well, to center both the text slider and the bullets, which are now flex items, horizontally and vertically. Save that, but we cannot see anymore the bullets div. So let me just give it here a width of something like 100 pixels, and now we can see it. Great. Now both flex items are in one row, so to make them go vertically instead, we just have to change here flex direction to column, and that's it. Great. Let's style now this text. So first thing we wanna do here is to show only the first line and hide the others. Now we're not gonna use the opacity property in this case because we wanna create here kind of text slider. So let's first grab the text wrap div, which is, as you can see here, the container of the text group, the big one. Then here we wanna give it a maximum height of 2.2 rem. That means it's gonna have a fixed height of 2.2 rem. After we give it that height, we need to hide all the content that will go beyond it. So for that, I'm gonna set overflow to hidden. And finally, let's give it a background color of green so that we can visualize our div. Save that. So right now we cannot see anymore the second and the third lines, because after we give the text wrap div that height of 2.2 rem, they become beyond the div, and since we set overflow to hidden, they have been hidden. After that, you want to make sure that each line is going to have the same height as the text wrap div. So to do that, we need first to target all the H2 hiddens we have inside the text group div, like so. Now we're not going to use the height property to do that, because even if we give them the same height as the text wrap div, the actual text inside the H2 will not be vertically centered. Instead, we're going to use the line height property, which will give it the same height as the text wrap div, and it will also center the actual text inside that H2 hidden. So let's set that to 2.2 rem, which is the height of the text wrap div, and there we go. Great. Now the way that this text slider will work is by moving up and down this text group div. To understand more, let's consider the text wrap div, which is that green area, as a window or as a visible area. So if you want to show the second line, we will just have to move up the text group div until we can see the second line by that visible area. Before we try that out, let me just center our lines in the horizontal axis very quickly. So we're gonna select the text group div, which is again the container of our H2 hiddens, or we can call them our lines. Then in here, we're just gonna set display to flex direction to column to make sure that the lines will go vertically as a column, and finally text align to center to push the lines to the middle, like so. Great, let's move on. So as I was saying, if you want to say the second line, we need to move up the text group div, and the best way to move it up is by using the transform property. So let's say translate y to move it along the y-axis, then let's add here minus 2.2 rem. So that will push the text group div backwards by 2.2 rem, which is exactly the same height of the first line. Save that. So as you can see, the first line moved up and the second line took its place. Let's say now we want to show the third line. So we just have to add here as well the second line height, which is again 2.2. So 2.2 plus 2.2 is equal to 4.4. Save that, and there we go. Nice. So later we'll give this some transition. This way, when we're gonna move to a certain line, we're gonna have a nice and smooth sliding animation. Great. So that's how the text slider will work. Let's remove now this green background color, and let's also bring back the text group to 0 so that we can see again the first line. Nice. Now each line is going to have a font weight of 600 and a font size of 1.6 rem. So as you can see, the lines are now bigger and also a little bit thinner. Great. Now if we go back to the text slider div, which is again the container of both the text wrapper and the bullets, then we give it a background color of red, you will see that it's not filling the remaining space. So to fix that, we need to move to the big container, which is the carousel div that holds both the image part and the text slider part. Here we're gonna first add the display of grid because we want to specify some rows inside of that. So again, to define rows, we use the grid template rows property. Now I'm gonna give the row that holds the image part a height of auto, and I'm gonna give the second row that holds the text slider a height of 1 of r. Now this might be a little bit confusing, but don't worry. So basically both auto and 1 of r work the same, so they both take one part of the available space. But things change when we use them together. So when we use auto with the fraction unit wins. In other words, auto will shrink to the content height and the fraction unit will take all the remaining space. In our case, this means that the first row will shrink to the image's height and the text slider div will fill the rest of the height. Great. Now let's also give this a padding bottom of 2 rem, like so. Now we can remove this background color. Great. Let's move now to the bullets div and create the actual bullets, because right now we just have a couple of empty span elements. So let's first give the text wrap div a margin bottom of 2.5 rem. This way we're gonna have some space between the text and the bullets. Now we can remove this background color as well as the width and height because we don't need them anymore. Then let's go ahead and start creating the actual bullets. So let's target each span element inside the bullets div. Now each span here represents a bullet, so 3 span elements means 3 bullets. Now first thing we need to do here is give our spans a display of block because they were in line by default. After we give them a display of block, we can now set a width and height. So let's set a width of 0.5 rem and a height of 0.5 rem as well. After that, let's give them a background color of AAA, which is by the way a gray color. So as you can see, we have now a couple of gray squares going vertically. After that, we want our spans to go horizontally instead, so let's move to the bullets div, which is their parent. Then let's give it a display of flex. Now this will make the span elements next to each other. Let's also set align items to center and justify content to center to make sure that they're going to be aligned in the center. Great. Next, we want to give our spans a margin of 0.25 rem in left and right, like so. Then we want to give them a border radius of 50% so they turn into circles. And finally, let's give them a cursor of pointer so we get that pointer cursor when we hover on the bullets. Last thing we need to do is style the bullet that has that active class. So as you can see here, it's going to be wider and also it's going to have that black background color. In our case, the first bullet is the one that has that active class by default. So let's move back here and select the span element with the class of active. Then in here, we're just gonna make the width a little bit bigger, like 1.1 rem. Then we're gonna change background color to 151111, which is that black color. Now let's also change border radius to 1 rem because a border radius of 50% works properly only if width is equal to height. Great, so there is the active bullet. Let's move back to the demo version. Now it's time to make this carousel work. So for example, if we click on one of these bullets, it will take us to the appropriate image and the appropriate line. So back here, we need first to give each bullet here a custom attribute that we will name as a value, which will tell us which image and which line to show. So the first bullet is going to have a data value equal to 1, and for the second bullet is going to be equal to 2, and finally for the third bullet is going to be equal to 3. So now every time we click on one of these bullets, using JavaScript, we're gonna get the value of its data value attribute. This way we're gonna know which image to show and which line of the text slider we need to show. So for example, if we click on the second bullet, that means the value of the data value attribute is going to be equal to 2, which also means that we're gonna show the second image and the second line. So yeah, that's exactly how the carousel will work. Let's move now to our JavaScript code. So here we need first to grab some elements from the HTML. First we need to grab the bullets, so let's say here document.querySelector all, make sure to add all because they are a group of elements. Then let's say bullet span, so that will target each span element inside the bullets div. After that we need to grab the images, so let's create a constant named images in which we're gonna hold our images. So let's say document.querySelector all.image. Great, now we can come underneath that and take our bullets. So for each bullet we have, I'm gonna take that bullet and then give it an event listener of click. Great, so whenever we click on that bullet, we wanna run a function named moveSlider. Nice, now we still need to define this function. So let's come above that, then let's create a function with the name moveSlider. Now first thing we need to do here is whenever we click on a bullet, we need to move the active class to that bullet we clicked so that it becomes wider and it gets that black color. To do that, we have first to remove the active class from all the bullets to make sure that no bullet has that active class. So let's say bullets.forEach. So for each bullet we have, we're gonna take that bullet and remove the active class from it. Now if you're wondering why we remove the active class from all the bullets even if only one bullet has that active class, well, that's because we don't know exactly which bullet has that active class. So to make sure that we remove the active class from that bullet, we remove this from all the bullets. After that, we need to add the active class to the bullet we clicked. So for that, we just have to say this to refer to the bullet we clicked, get the class list, and then add that active class. Hit save. So now when I'm gonna click on another bullet, the active class will move to that bullet. So as you can see, whenever we click on a new bullet, it becomes wider and it gets that black color. Now this happens immediately, so let's go back to our style sheet, then let's give the bullets a transition of 0.3 seconds. Save that, and now when I'm gonna click on another bullet, we get a nice and smooth animation. Great. Now whenever we click on a bullet, we need to show the image that corresponds to the bullet we clicked. So for example, if we click on the second bullet, we need to show the second image. And if we click on the third bullet, we need to show the third image, and so on. Now the way that we're gonna know which image to show is by using the data value attribute. So for that, we're gonna create a variable named index. Here we need to hold the value of the data value attribute, specifically of the bullet that we clicked. So let's say this to refer to the bullet we clicked. Now there is multiple ways to access to the value of an attribute, but there is a simpler way for those attributes whose name starts with data dash, like we have in our case data dash value. So we just have to add here .dataset followed by the word we have after data dash, which is in our case value. So yeah, now let's console.log this to make sure that everything is working fine. So let's first open the console, then let's click for example on the second bullet. And there we go, the console is showing 2, which is exactly the data value of the second bullet. Let's click now on the third bullet and the console will show 3. Great. Now using this index variable, we're gonna know which image here we need to target and show. So for example, if index is equal to 1, we're gonna target the image -1 class, and if it's equal to 2, we're gonna target the image -2 class, and so on. So let's go back here and create a constant named current image. So this is where we're gonna hold the image that we wanna show. In here we're gonna say document.querySelector, this time without all because we're gonna grab only one image. Then in between these parentheses I'm gonna add this time backticks. So they are the same as codes, except these one allow us to interpolate variables and expressions into the string. So let's say .image dash. Then after that you wanna add the index variable. This way if the index is equal to 1, it's gonna grab the image -1 class, and so on. So to interpolate a variable, we add a $, curly brackets, then we type the variable name, which is in our case index. Great. Now let's console.log this current image variable, then let's see what's gonna happen. So I'm gonna click now on the second bullet, and there we go, the console is showing the second image. Great. Now after we get the image that we need to show, we can go ahead and actually show it. So let's first make sure that no image has the show class. For that we're gonna look through the images. So let's say for each image we have, we wanna get its class list, then remove the show class from it. After that we will take the current image, get its class list, then we wanna add that show class to it. So yeah, I think that's it. Let's save that, then let's click on this bullet, and there we go. Let's click now on the third bullet, and as you can see the third image has been shown. Great. Currently, this happens immediately without any animations or something of that stuff. So let's go ahead and add some animations around the team switch like we have here. So going back to our style sheet, I want to first give each image a transition on the opacity with a duration of 0.3 seconds. This way we're gonna have a nice fade animation around the image switch. Now if we take a look on the final version, you can see that each image is gonna have its own animation. So for example, the first image is kind of moves down, the third image on the other hand zooms in and rotates, and finally the second image is also zooming in. Let's start for now with the first image. So the first image is going to slide down while it's being shown. For that, let's first target the image -1 class. Now when the image is not shown, this means when it doesn't have the show class, we want to move it up by 50 pixels. So let's add transform, then in here we're gonna translate our image by 0 pixels in the x-axis and -50 pixels in the y-axis. After that, when the image is shown, we wanna move it back to its original position. So for that, we're just gonna add here transform none, which will basically remove any applied transformation on the image, including the -50 pixels translate. Now let's make sure we apply transition on the transform property as well, otherwise we're not gonna notice any difference. Now this one I want it to be longer than the opacity. For that I'm gonna do here 0.5 seconds. Great. Now let's try that out. So I'm gonna switch again to the first image, and there we go. So as you can see, the image smoothly slides down. Now we need to clip anything that goes beyond this whole carousel div to make sure that we don't see any part of the image that is beyond the div. So back here I'm gonna go back to the carousel div, then I'm gonna give it an overflow of hidden. Great, so now any part of the image that is beyond the carousel div will be hidden. Nice. Now we can move on and make the animation of the second image. So for this one I want it to be scaled down when it's hidden. This way when it will be shown, it's gonna smoothly zoom in. So to do that, we're just gonna duplicate this. This time we wanna target the image-show class. So now instead of translate the image, we wanna scale it. So let's scale it down to 0.4 horizontally and 0.5 vertically. Great. So now if I switch to another image, you can see that the second image smoothly scales down. And if I switch back to it, it's gonna zoom in back. Now let's do the animation of the last image. So as you can see, this one is going to zoom in and rotate at the same time. So back here we're gonna target the image-tree class. Then in here we're just gonna say transform scale. So when the image is hidden, I wanna scale it down to 0.3 both horizontally and vertically, and I also want to rotate it by -20 degrees. Save that, then let's move to another image, and there we go. So as you can see, it smoothly zooms in and rotates. Great, so that's it for the image slideshow. Let's move now to the last thing we have here, which is the text slider. Now the way that we're gonna move from one line to another is by moving that text group div up and down. So right now it has a translate y of 0, that's why it's showing the first line. Now going back to our JavaScript code, we need first to grab the text group div, which we will move up and down. So let's create below that a constant named text slider. Then let's set that to document.querySelector.textGroup. Great, so that will select the text group div. Now we need to translate it along the y-axis depending on the value of the index variable. So let's say text slider.style, then let's apply a transform on this. So we're gonna set that again to backtext because we're gonna interpolate later an expression into this. Then in here we're just gonna add translate y. Now let's say we wanna move to the second line, which is the one that says customize as you like. For that we're gonna do here negative since we want this to go up. Then we're gonna add 2.2 rem because actually each line takes up 2.2 rem. Hit save, then let's click on any bullet here. So as you can see, the second line, which is customize as you like, has been shown. Great, now that happened immediately without the sliding animation. So to fix that, we just have to give the text group div a transition of 0.5 seconds. And now when I'm gonna click on a bullet, the text will smoothly slide down like this. Great. Now we want to slide the text slider depending on the value of the index variable. So before rem, we want to interpolate an expression. Here we're going to first add some parentheses. So let's take the index variable and subtract it by 1 because index starts with 1, so it's like 1, 2, 3. But in this case, we want it to start from 0, so it becomes 0, 1, 2. After that, we're going to multiply this by 2.2, which is the height of each line we have, and that's it. So let's say for example that index is equal to 2. So 2 minus 1 equals 1. And 1 times 2.2 equals 2.2. Which means the text slider will move 2.2 rem. I think we should have here a minus because as I said before, we want to move this up. So let's go back here and do negative. Great. Let's try that out. So I'm gonna click on the second bullet and as you can see it slides down to the second line. Let's click on the third bullet and it will slide down to the third line. Let's also click on the first bullet and it will move back to the first line. Great. So yeah, that's it for our login and registration form. So we learned how to make this carousel. And we also learned how to make this slide and login and registration form. Now we still need to make this responsive on smaller screens because currently it's not. So let's go ahead and do that very quickly. So yeah, that's it for today's video. If you reached this point of the video, make sure to subscribe and like the video if you find it valuable, and also feel free to leave a comment down below telling me what you want to see next in this channel. With that being said, thank you so much for watching and see you in the next tutorial.